Is metaphysics unfalsifiable? An interesting debate. What is metaphysics? The first section of A Philosophy of Glimpses suggests that metaphysics is mostly unfalsifiable, and I recently received feedback and responses that disagreed. Thomas Jockin particularly presented strong arguments against the idea, disagreements for which I'm grateful, for they stimulated my thinking on the topic. I've personally tried to make the case that it didn't matter if metaphysics was unfalsifiable, but it's still a debate that I've been convinced is worth entertaining. Please note that Mr. Jockin is focused on a metaphysics of lacks, and it is regarding this kind of metaphysics that he mostly wants to defend the possibility of falsification. When I personally talk about falsification, I'm mostly using it in the narrow sense meant by Karl Popper. I do not mean that metaphysics isn't disprovable or that the field is ultimately a collection of phantasms. What is falsifiable is that which Popper argued could be a science, and by suggesting metaphysics could be unfalsifiable, I'm suggesting it might not be a science like physics. Is this right? Perhaps not. We'll have to debate and see, as we'll also have to determine if something that is falsifiable must also be objective and vice versa. A number of terms must be examined and pulled apart. Section 1. As discussed in The Science of Things Failing, there is an apologetic argument for God's existence that claims that if one person in all of human history actually experienced God, then God would exist. Since billions of people genuinely claim they have experienced God, even to the point of being willing to die and suffer for their beliefs, then it is extremely probable that God exists. No, this doesn't prove God exists, but it at least makes theology a rational subject to explore. If for one person on the planet a lack is objectively real, while for everyone else the lack is only subjective, is it the case that the lack is objectively real? I think this is an important question for considering Mr. Jockin's objection to the idea that metaphysics is unfalsifiable. While Mr. Jockin may agree that mind-dependent lacks might be unfalsifiable, he wants to make a careful distinction with object-based lacks so that we can highlight the objective and falsifiable reality of lacks. I think this is a very fair point and deserves consideration, as elaborated on in Section 5 of A Philosophy of Glimpses, though I would note that regardless if the new metaphysics proves falsifiable or unfalsifiable, the overall project and trajectory remain constant. If anything, Jockin's point on the possible objectivity of certain lacks will only strengthen the case for the new metaphysics. Ultimately, I think the question comes down to what criteria something must pass in order to be considered falsifiable, and if it is the case that what is objective is necessarily unfalsifiable and vice versa. Personally, I like how Jonathan Routes lays out the case in his amazing Kindly Inquisitors, but what constitutes falsifiable beliefs, where he writes that science relies on experience, but only experience of no one in particular. For Routes, science makes particular persons interchangeable, which means something cannot be falsified if that status is people-dependent, especially particular persons with particular subjectivities. If a bridge collapses and turns into a pile of debris, certainly to the original builder, the pile of debris will objectively lack bridgeness. In the very objectness of the debris, there would also be embedded a lack to those who once saw and or used the bridge, to those who could see the parts of the road out of which the bridge fell, and to those who helped build the bridge. Relative to these people, the pile of debris would be lacking something, and not just in their opinion. There really was a bridge that they could use and stand on. To claim the bridge only existed according to them would seem silly and strange. Their sense of lack would be based on a hard reality of a bridge they used and that was actually, not potentially, present. To refer to the existence of the bridge as subjective, like some opinion about a movie, would seem absurd. Well, that's true, and certainly it would be wrong to say the existence of the bridge was just a matter of opinion, as it would also be strange to suggest that the lack of the bridge and the debris was in no way whatsoever based on an object-based reality. But the question we face is this: is the lack of the bridge what anyone would experience when they encounter the pile of debris? Is the experience of the lack only the experience of no one in particular? If not, the lack of bridgeness could in some way be objective-based, with the IV in parentheses, and yet not falsifiable according to Popper or Routes, suggesting distinctions in the categories. Jonathan Routes claims that the falsifiable is what anyone would have seen in the lab, which assuming this criteria is valid, means the pile of debris only has falsifiability as the remains of a bridge if anyone could look at the debris and no bridgeness is lacking. For falsification, particular persons must be interchangeable, which begs the question, does this hold regarding lacks? Please note that even if it didn't, there would be something to the argument that the lack of the bridge was based on an object, the debris, and the objective reality that people once used the bridge to cross a river. Considering this, it's possible for metaphysics to be objective-based even if it's not always falsifiable. It might be the case that everything falsifiable is objective-based, but it perhaps doesn't have to be the case that everything objective-based must be falsifiable or object-based. The categories might ultimately prove distinct, though that doesn't mean that the ultimate validity of the subjects changes at all. Section 2. For the engineer of the bridge, everyone who used the bridge, and everyone who can observe the context or setting of the pile of debris, the lack of the bridgeness is objective. It is not merely subjective. But does that mean it is falsifiable? Following Popper's critique, it doesn't seem so, because if I were to find a boy raised in the forest by wolves and brought him to the pile of debris, that wolf child would probably not experience a lack of bridgeness. Rather, the wolf child would experience a pile of stones. This might be a silly point, and certainly for the majority, the debris is lacking its prior form. But x lacking y for the majority is not technically enough for the premise x lacks y to be falsifiable. Now, to go back to the opening paragraphs about the existence of God, perhaps we believe that if x lacking y is falsifiable to a single person on the planet, then x lacking y is objectively falsifiable. But that would not hold for the criteria of Popper. At the very least, though, we could say that lacks exist in a space between objectivity and subjectivity, falsifiability and unfalsifiability, and that is indeed an important point to recognize. If a bridge collapsed and left a pile of debris, and someone looked at the debris 1,000 years later, would that person objectively experience a lack of bridgeness? If the road which the bridge was once part of eroded away, if the river which the bridge reached across dried up, and if the very existence of bridges was forgotten thanks to the invention of hovercrafts, then the observer probably would not. The pile of debris would just be a pile of debris. Hence, knowing that the objectness of the pile was lacking bridgeness would be contingent upon knowing its past use, being able to observe its context, and even possessing the idea of a bridge. Considering this, the understanding that the pile was lacking would be contingent on universally objective, even though the lack would be based on the objectness of the pile. Okay, but come on. Outside these strange thought experiments, the lack of the debris would be objective, right? Isn't there something to be said about the lacking being practically objective? There is, and I like the word practical here, for it means almost and lived out simultaneously. Certainly, the lack of debris is practically objective, but for Popper, that would not be enough to make something falsifiable. The bar something must overcome to be falsifiable is a very high bar indeed, and very few things pass over it. And it should be noted that many philosophers of science today disagree that falsification should be used as a hard criteria for defining pseudoscience from real science. After all, is in theory falsifiable? But if we're sticking to Popper and following Rauch's understanding of falsification, which I share, then lacks and a metaphysics based on lacks will prove unfalsifiable. To stress, this does not mean metaphysics can't orbit around objective-based realities, nor does it mean metaphysics can't be practically objective. Only that metaphysics probably doesn't fall under the narrow understanding of falsification presented by Popper. As I've hopefully made clear, though, that doesn't matter. Additionally, in my other works, I hope I've disproven those who believe that everything which isn't falsifiable is nonsense. That is taking things way too far. Lastly, I want to stress that saying metaphysics is mostly unfalsifiable does not mean metaphysics isn't testable or disprovable. Testable and falsifiable are not similarities. It is possible to test and disprove what cannot be falsified. But wait, how can I disprove what cannot be falsified? That doesn't make sense. Well, it's because I can build evidence against a case to the point where it eventually becomes untenable, even though I can't establish with certainty that the case is false. That is often the case with conspiracy theories. No, I can't disprove with certainty the unfalsifiable, but I can disprove it with confidence. Section 3. Falsifiable, objective, testable, disprovable, empirical, all of these similar and often overlapping terms are ones that I hope to keep distinct. By questioning the falsification of metaphysics, I have not meant here to suggest that metaphysics is a game of imagination or some purely speculative art. Metaphysics is based on objective realities, experiences, practical uses, and the like. It's just that metaphysics doesn't seem like it depends on the experience of no one in particular, thus rendering it unfalsifiable. That said, readers may disagree with my understanding of Popper's falsification, and on those grounds the debate may continue. There is also room for debate because someone might disagree that something must be universally objective to be objective at all, as they might disagree that something has to be universally falsifiable to be falsifiable at all. It would seem everything falsifiable must be objective, but it might not be the case that everything objective must be falsifiable. I don't know. On these points, I don't have a strong view. I want to stress that metaphysics doesn't need to be falsifiable to matter and prove itself a valid undertaking. This work is meant to entertain a debate, but ultimately it is not a debate that I think is necessary for the justification of a new metaphysics. Regardless, the work continues.